Listening Library presents Tomorrowland by Elizabeth Rudnick. Read for you by Katie Schorr.
Part 1. Yesterday. Chapter 1. Pittsfield, New York, 1964. Summer in upstate New York was always brief. When the flowers finally bloomed and the leaves finally appeared, they came upon the countryside with the swiftness of a storm. For the farmers who made their living tilling the land, the season was a blessing and a curse. A blessing because summer meant money in their pockets and food on the table come winter, and a curse because it was always a race against time. So as soon as the first warm wind blew, every man, woman, and child would be out on the farm, doing their part. Well, almost every child. As the sun rose on this particular harvesting day, 10-year-old Frank Walker was not getting ready to help his father on their farm. Instead, he stood inside the barn, tinkering. Above him, the old rusty weather vane squeaked as it moved slowly in the sticky morning wind. But Frank barely registered the noise. He was too busy finishing up his project. As Frank looked down at the object in front of him, a smile spread across his young face. His eyes shone brightly with anticipation. That was it. That was the moment he had been working toward all summer. Running a hand through his messy brown hair, Frank took a deep breath. Then he put an old football helmet on his head. A pair of goggles rested atop the helmet. It seemed an odd addition until Frank leaned over and picked up the jetpack resting in front of him. The jetpack was not much to look at on first sight. Frank had had to use whatever scrap metal he could get his hands on, so no two parts seemed to match exactly. He had also soldered the metal himself, so the machine looked a bit like a poorly stitched metal version of Frankenstein's monster. But still, there were hints of beauty to the jetpack. Frank had spent hours lovingly crafting metal wings, which were now attached to the back of the pack, and while there were clearly flaws, it all appeared rather streamlined. Hearing a rooster caw, Frank started. He had lost track of time, and now he didn't have much of it left. He needed to get out of the barn and into the fields before his father found him. He grabbed the pack, secured it onto his back, and headed out the door. First, though, he grabbed a pail of water. Better to be safe than sorry. Safety precautions in tow, Frank quickly made his way into the middle of the closest field. The sun was rising higher and higher, bathing everything it touched in an orange hue. It hit Frank's pack, and for a brief moment the thing sparkled like something brand new and futuristic. Unaware of the transformation, Frank grabbed the cord dangling from the side of the pack. Then he took another deep breath as he looked up. "Please, God," he whispered, "don't let me blow up." Lowering his goggles, Frank began the countdown. T-minus 10, 9, 8. As the numbers got smaller, his voice grew shakier with nerves. 7, 6, 5, he gulped. 4, 3, 2. Frank pulled down on the cord with all the strength his 10-year-old arm could muster. With a loud growl, the engine came to life, and a moment later, flames spurted out of the bottom of the rocket. It was working. And then it wasn't. Instead of propelling Frank high into the sky, the force of the engine threw him down onto his belly. Within seconds, he was blasting through the field, his body cutting a path between the dirt and crops. Ah! After what felt like hours, but was actually only seconds, there came a sound Frank never thought he would be happy to hear. The unmistakable of the jetpack's flames sputtering out. A moment later, Frank slid to a stop. To his surprise, he was alive and relatively unscathed. The field behind him, however, had not been quite as lucky. As he turned around, his eyes grew wide. Patches of fire had sprouted up in his wake and were growing larger. Frank let out a shout and leapt to his feet. He ran and frantically stomped at the burning crops. By the time he reached the pail of water he had left, he had managed to put out most of the fires. But then he realized there was something else burning. Letting out another shout, Frank tore the jetpack off his back and threw it to the ground. He dumped the bucket of water over it. There was a sizzle as the flames went out. Pulling off his goggles, Frank looked down at his masterpiece, now a singed pile of metal. He let out a sigh. Not all inventions work the first go-around, he told himself. Einstein had tried hundreds of formulas before he came up with E=mc². Frank just needed to go back to the drawing board. Things would go smoother next time. Inside the barn, Frank sat on a workbench, repairing his jetpack. On the wall in front of him, a board had been covered with comic panels, sketches, and pages ripped from magazines. This was Frank's idea board. In the middle of it all was a brochure for the World's Fair happening then in Queens, New York. As the radio blared a Beach Boys tune through his homemade headphones, Frank smiled. This was what he loved to do more than anything in the world. Create. This was what he wanted to do with his life. Not plant crops and harvest them and then do it all again. If only his father could understand. A dark shadow suddenly washed over him. Frank looked up. His father stood in the open door of the barn, his arms crossed over his chest. Unlike his son, Pa was a man of the land. Always had been and always would be. That was why seeing Frank surrounded by odd gadgets and gizmos made Pa's hackles rise. "Ground's burnt out there," he said after Frank had pulled down his headphones. "Really?" Frank replied. "Weird." There was a pause as Pa stared at his son, his eyes drilling into the young boy. He knew Frank was playing dumb, just like he knew Frank wanted to do anything but farm. "It's getting warm," Pa finally said. "We need to start harvesting today." "Yeah," Frank replied. "That's, why I got up early." Pa raised an eyebrow and nodded at the jetpack. "I thought we talked about that." "You talked about it," Frank said defiantly. Then he looked at the ground. His father hated when he talked back. Pa narrowed his eyes. "What makes you think you're gonna make that thing fly?" Frank shrugged. "I'm optimistic." "You're 10, Pa pointed out. "Carl Ben started engineering university when he was 10, Frank pointed out. When his father just looked at him blankly, he explained. He invented cars. Pa shook his head. "Henry Ford invented cars," he retorted. "Henry Ford produced cars," Frank said, correcting him. Instantly, he wished he hadn't said it. He had pushed too far. Sure enough, Pa's face grew red and his frown deepened. "You're wasting your time," Pa growled. Frank always backed down. Today, he wouldn't, even though he knew he was playing with fire. "I'm not," he shouted. "This contraption doesn't work," Pa shouted back. "It's not a contraption," Frank cried. "I can make it work." "No, you can't." Pa's words boomed through the barn, causing Frank to take a nervous step back. For a long moment, father and son just stood there, staring at each other, their chests heaving. And then Frank took a deep breath. "I'm not giving up," he said softly. Pa reacted instantly. With one swift sweep of his arm, he knocked everything off the workbench. Papers, tools, even pieces of the jetpack went flying. His face fire engine red, Pa turned and looked at his son. He had had this argument for the last time. Frank had to stop pretending he would be anything other than a farmer. That was what walkers did. They farmed. "You want to use your optimism?" Pa asked. "Use it to harvest that field." With that, he left the barn. Behind his father, Frank's face mirrored the anger in his. But there was also resentment in Frank's eyes. Looking down at his jetpack lying in pieces, Frank felt trapped. How could he ever get his father to see that he was good at this kind of thing? That he could help in his own way if Pa would only let him? And then his eyes landed on something on his workbench. An old gear. He smiled. He was going to show his father exactly what he could do. Pa was still fuming. As he stood in the kitchen frying some eggs, he kept replaying the scene in the barn in his head. Time after time he had tried to reason with Frank, and time after time it had ended the same way, with the two of them angry. Turning to grab a plate from the cupboard, Pa paused. Then he tilted his head. He had heard something he shouldn't be hearing. The noise of an engine. specifically the noise of his
Sample complete. Ready to continue?